Let's be honest with ourselves. Either God is the ultimate creator, or evolution did it all. There is no third possibility. Does God exist? This question, perhaps more than any other, seems like the most fundamental question a person can ask. And it also has mental health considerations within it, because, depending on the answer, we might go through life either nihilistically or hopeful. Maybe there is no complete scientific answer, but certainly there are some important things to consider. So whether the answer will be yes or no, the implications will be profound. Because this is an existential question, and, due to this apparent uncertainty, there is a cruel type of mental torment that sentient human beings can experience, since we are aware of our own mortality, unlike any other creature on the planet it seems. And some people try to confront this problem by participating in dangerous activities. Have you ever leaned over the edge of the abyss and stared right down into it? Hence we might grasp at any tiny thread of truth that comes within our reach before we slip away into darkness. So, what type of evidence supports God's existence? There is this question of God's divine hiddenness, and many people remain agnostic on certain issues, and who can blame them? But it's ironic that some atheists criticize God believers, calling them superstitious, while perhaps imagining that there is no burden of proof required for their own ideas, as if their own position is somehow devoid of superstition, so it's not clear how the atheist's argument could be valid in that way either. So we need to look for a more satisfactory explanation. We might begin by acknowledging that most people, it seems, don't claim to have experienced some sort of miraculous, divine, road to Damascus, epiphany. And we've probably neither observed nor experienced those kinds of epiphenomena ourselves, although it would be honest to admit that this has neither disproved such a thing. So belief, and disbelief, can wait for the evidence. And perhaps many secular people today are more inclined to avoid naively coming at the problem top-down, if possible, being that they are skeptical, and maybe the older a person gets, the more skeptical they might be. Perhaps we would like to think, and hope, that our skepticism doesn't come so much from arrogance nor cynicism, but more from humility. However, we're only human, so, who knows? On the other hand, it's ironic that some, being atheists not only out of skepticism, instead they also, therein, don't want God to exist, for some reason. Perhaps it is because of the man-made, non-biblical, immortal soul and hellfire doctrines, traditions within Christendom, that puts them off God. So Christendom has a lot to answer for, when in such cases these denominations have been going beyond what is written in the Bible, adopting traditions and teaching pagan ideas that contradict biblical canon. Or perhaps it's to do with the way in which the depraved and cruel Canaanite culture was obliterated. Or maybe it's the problem of unstopped evil, or perhaps some people just enjoy being evil. But, putting all those ad hominem pros and cons aside, even though it is conceivable that the cause for doubt might be divine hiddenness and the problem of evil, equally or even more likely it seems that the theory of evolution has a lot more to do with the advent of modern atheism. So, unlike the emotional arguments, the question of origins is where the claimed scientific conjectures have always been, that some people say are more logically motivated. It seems even less certain of how capable the human mind is at completely working out the mystery of existence, but perhaps, if one wants to remain objective about this and be more scientific, then it's good to deconstruct one's belief system and rebuild it from the ground up, using physical evidence, that is, ironically perhaps, faith, in either evolution or the existence of God, choosing from either model, positing which is a better idea of what the ultimate creator of the universe is. And from there, depending on the answer, One might then go about objectively eliminating false ideas, from whichever doctrine they might have deduced to be more sound. We generally don't like being lied to. That is of course for people who despise stupidity and want to seek truth, and don't want to unnecessarily remain under the foggy cover of darkness, engulfed within a cocoon of ignorance and falsehood, and so would logically try their best to avoid being deceived. Faith in the acceptance of God as the universal sovereign is another idea, but that's a somewhat different discussion about a far more traditional subset within a much wider set of belief systems, so for now we can sympathize with those who might avoid going down that rabbit hole. So in such a case, this is typically not where the investigation would begin. Regarding atheism, of course no one can directly observe the existence of God, and in more modern times, atheists have advocated materialist evolution theory to be the great God substitute. And perhaps a version of evolution was touted even quite some time before Charles Darwin, who put forward his theory for the origin of species by natural selection, which apparently, as people say, has both true and false ideas within it, based on certain lines of evidence, from which some atheists feel they might derive some sort of intellectual fulfillment, and perhaps in certain cases it might be reminiscent of some ancient Greek materialist philosophy. When Darwin used the word species in the title of his famous book, which he called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, well, aside from its racial and tyrannical overtones, species is a slippery word. It doesn't give you a firm basis for making any theological distinction about their origins, nor any naturalistic determination as to whether functional complexity could ever increase that way, whereas, more honestly calling that particular part of the theory, the hypothesis on the origin of higher taxonomic orders by means of natural selection, the idea which some people call macroevolution, would more sufficiently define that particular belief system, from which there could then truly be the basis for scientifically rigorous conjecture, as to either the theological or materialistic implications of that claim. Some people don't like that distinctive term, macroevolution, and sometimes perhaps it is because they don't want the question of God as the ultimate creator to compete with the claim of natural evolution as a universal creator, and only want to allow discussion of a less specific definition of naturally determined evolution, and if true, that is one disingenuous way of trying to underhandedly make theology appear less relevant, effectively formulating a naturalistic argument by exclusion. Ironically, some creationists don't like that word either, because of its potential to create confusion, and some other people might not like any word involving evolution at all, for any reason. But logically, for the sake of objectivity, we should reject all such extreme positions. Both worldviews have the prime reality problem, explaining the existence of existence, and whatever you might believe to be the first, uncreated, self-existent cause of everything else. So, that problem, by itself, seemingly doesn't get you any closer to the ultimate truth of our existence. Therefore we may ask ourselves, what kind of useful evidence exists? There is plenty of available evidence around, but evidence for what exactly? And is it conclusive, either evidence for, or against, God's existence? Certainly we can cite plenty of evidence that agrees with whichever way a person has chosen to believe, or wants to believe, whether or not they have made a choice. That kind of evidence is often called confirmation bias. For instance, some may feel that after praying, they believe that God helped them in some way, which is all well and good, but it's not clear how that claim, on its own, could ever convince a hardened skeptic. Another example of this would be someone who touts evolution as the ultimate creator. They essentially claim that the fossil evidence represents an overall natural gradual increase of complexity in life, and so they cherry-pick certain items from the fossils, based on similarities and differences, and deliberately line them up in such a way so as to appear supportive of a gradualistic hypothesis of progressive upward evolution. Based on that kind of evidence alone, it's not proven to be necessarily either wrong or right, and you might try to make a cumulative case, with enough of it. But, more importantly, you would have either overlooked or deliberately ignored the more objective analysis of the fossil record, which reveals that many of those punctuated discrete forms in the fossil record have corresponding living counterparts today, that is, with many of exactly the same gaps of dissimilarity within today's biological diversity, and it seems that these fossil gap counterparts of dissimilarity, past and present, would be an impossibly unlikely array of coincidences, to often match up, either exactly or somewhat closely this way, given that the materialist hypothesis assumes that all those gaps represent missing transitional forms of life that supposedly existed, and also might assume that there were periods of history absent of fossilization, or that some fossils were naturally destroyed somehow, while ignoring the reality of what failed to be predicted by that idea. Yes, what would have not been expected according to that hypothesis, that there are similar discrete counterparts in today's life forms, that is, with matching gaps. So, when assuming specific reasons for believing in an incompleteness of the fossil record, this, by itself, doesn't explain the past punctuations concurring with the present punctuated discontinuity of things alive today. So the claimed type of incompleteness, the presumed reason for partiality of existing fossil evidence, that is, even if assuming there was damaged, or deleted, sections of fossil continuity, even if that idea were true, it is incredibly unlikely to be the reason for all the discrete fossil punctuations being representative of things that were existing in the past while corresponding to what is alive, existing now, and therefore, that evidence, alone, doesn't seem to save this hypothetical continuum. No. It looks unable to save that gradualistic idea from falsification. This naturalistic, gradualistic, assumption of how biological complexity might have evolved appears to be wrong. Therefore it seems that the ad hoc hypothesis, punctuated equilibrium, was invented by Stephen Jay Gould, who was an adherent of the macroevolution belief system, in what appears to be, not only, an updated version of the hopeful monsters hypothesis, but also, a feeble attempt at formulating an alternative naturalistic evolutionary explanation for those geographically widespread, consistently punctuated, remaining fossilized forms, which, as already discussed, is claimed by some to be lots of coincidences, in that they have also turned out to be largely representative of today's life forms. Even worse, his in situ contrivance also has far bigger, seemingly insurmountable, obstacles to overcome, genetic improbability barriers, insurmountable barriers that seem to prevent functional complexity from ever naturally increasing. So these examples, from cherry-picking while ignoring the bigger picture, demonstrate why this kind of circumstantial evidence is generally considered weak, and sometimes inadmissible, especially by itself. So, we must remain objective and not let any belief system overcome our power of reason. It seems obvious that we might be fairly good at distinguishing what we do know from what we don't know, but, for truth seekers, probably the strongest kind of evidence, especially in law and science, is definitive evidence, which can distinguish between true and false. Making such distinctions is a far more powerful type of evidence. It is useful when an idea is testable, and more specifically, when you can do some kind of repeatable physical experiment to ascertain whether a theory, or a hypothesis within, is right or wrong, instead of just unknowable. A large part of science is not so much about gaining knowledge as it is about the reduction of uncertainty, but even more so, sometimes the elimination of ignorance and falsehood, sometimes uncovering facts. when it comes to natural evolution being put forward as the ultimate creator, this is where you can make some real scientifically testable distinctions about whether an idea is right or wrong, what is known, and what is, as yet, unknown. We humans hate not knowing, but in a lot of cases, we are stuck with that problem. So here is what we do know, or more precisely put, here is what science has definitively proven true: physical things decay. This at first might seem unremarkable, because we take this fact for granted. Certainly, each day you look in the mirror, you are a little more rotten than the day before. We know this, and no one has ever proven the opposite, not for any natural process. Hence, we subconsciously distinguish the arrow of time when we say that everything is aging. We also know that entropy, the fundamental reason why everything continually decays, is statistical. The laws of probability overwhelmingly make every system eventually head toward complete disorganization, and this is happening all the time, without let up, from the macroscopic level down to the submicroscopic level. Hence nothing physical lasts forever. Without miracles, none of us will be around for very long at all. Thus we are experiencing the tragic absurdity of life. Indeed, even the most atheistic physicists generally accept that the entire universe is subject to the continuous process of decay. The cosmos is randomizing, equalizing, and dissipating toward disorder and cold nothingness, and this inevitably raises an obvious question: how did the universe begin more ordered? Or as a professional scientist might say, how did the universe begin in a lower entropy state? This question arises from what physicists generally call the past hypothesis. There have been various hypothetical ideas put forth in an attempt to naturalistically eliminate the need for an intelligent creator, but, when thoroughly analyzed, they all fall short on some level, mainly because the entropy problem persists, and, when using such logic, you often end up with an infinite regress of hypothetical causes, all requiring their own type of fine-tuning, and even multiverse arguments fail at this level. Therefore the so-called anthropic principle is a tautology of limited value, within this particular line of investigation. For Darwinian evolution to go uphill, natural selection needs something of higher organizational complexity to select from, in the first place, in order to support any Darwinian tree of life hypothesis. Otherwise all you can say that is true, with any degree of certainty, is from what can be observed, downhill natural processes. And because we consistently observe this, that physical things evolve in such a way so as to deteriorate over time, it appears that time is the enemy of complexity, not the friend of it, that the materialist belief system would like it to be. So, appealing to lots of time doesn't help it at all, but seems to destroy that belief. No one has been able to falsify the seemingly obvious, that it is highly likely those statistical principles would equally apply to genetic information, and all biological mechanisms and functions, over successive generations, as it applies to every other physical process over time, all things that we know of in the universe, even when taking natural selection into account. This is the elephant in the room for science. So, why there doesn't seem to be more scientists who are skeptical about the claim of Darwinian processes as a creator of higher taxonomic groups and some other types of hypothetical increasing complexity, is puzzling, since scientists, out of professional necessity, are required to be skeptical. So, if we are being truly objective here, then, in principle, arguments from consensus don't carry much weight. The fossil record does not support gradualism at all, but instead what is actually observed in the geological columns are many, sudden, appearances of complexity in those fossils themselves. Is it any wonder then, that even Charles Darwin, back in his day, honestly admitted, in his famous book, that he was troubled by this, in reference to his theory? And the problem still remains today, and it has actually gotten worse for that idea, contrary to what some people might have been led to believe. So which belief, when choosing a creator, has more superstition? Some say God, and others say evolution. Okay, you can't see God, and there is the problem of evil to contend with, but we can't see things naturally evolving into something better either. But, in many cases, what we do see on human timescales is things naturally evolving into something worse, often perhaps into something more evil. Everything malfunctioning and getting disorganized. So the committed atheist wants to believe in the existence of some unproven, rare, natural process that can supposedly go in the opposite direction of all experiment and general observation, of which they want to believe can make things better, and somehow do it over vast unobservable timescales. And this belief system looks more superstitious than believing in an invisible God, because we haven't seen anything in open systems go the other way from Darwinian processes, let alone closed systems, and, even more specifically, never in small isolated, inbred populations, have we ever seen things get better for the long-term greater good of a species. But when the direction of evolution can be empirically detected within something, it is always observed to degenerate. Okay, we know how things can evolve to go out of equilibrium in an open system, when discussing conservation of energy, but how could mere localized disequilibrium ever naturally evolve into functional complexity, no matter how much available energy is fed into an open system, and no matter how much time you give it? We've only ever observed it going the other way. And, more importantly, what kind of natural selection might ever exist at that level, before the first DNA or RNA-based replicator? So we might strongly suspect that this particular idea is wrong. Nobody can prove such an idea to be anything more than just wild, undisciplined imagination. Some people might say the same thing about believing in God, but it would be groundbreaking, news headlines, and disturbing, if anyone ever proved the opposite of such repeatable scientific observations, because perhaps they would have demonstrated miracles, as if it were the second coming of Jesus. So materialist atheism is not only a religion, but also, in some sense, it is a far more superstitious ideology than the more traditional forms of faith that involve some kind of self-existent intelligent designer, as the ultimate creator, perhaps like the Abrahamic God Jehovah. It might be reasonable to believe that everything, not only the universe but also all the major life forms, initially came to exist in a more organized state. A person is free to believe what they want to, of course, but, from a scientific perspective, we know what we observe, and what we don't ever see happening now. If someone wants to believe in some unseen, unproven, naturalistic law of increasing functional complexity, that's fine, but realize that it's not scientific fact at all, and so it's not a sufficiently well-founded belief system either, but only an impoverished religion, ironically touted by those who claim to be anti-religious. On the other hand, the intelligent creation theory, which essentially says that things started more organized, agrees with, not only what statistical mechanics routinely demonstrates, but also with the universal decay processes that we all consistently see happening. So, the supernatural, invisible, God hypothesis, agrees with repeatable observations of nature, and therefore, on balance, it is far more scientifically founded. So, in this particular instance, perhaps we should be inclined to believe intelligent design theory more so than the atheists' convoluted ideas, where they suppose, but can't sufficiently explain their idea, how the creation of more complex novel function arises without intelligent design. In this area, essentially the atheists can only give you a naturalism of the gaps argument. This scientifically derived analysis of course sits uncomfortably with those who don't want to be accountable in any way whatsoever to a higher power, like God, but the scientific facts don't care about anyone's feelings. When we are able to scientifically discover the facts, they will just turn out to be whatever they are, whether we like them or not. Nature seems to point to something beyond itself. It appears from the facts that, ultimately, entropy defeats materialism, and this tends to make atheism look untenable, and the God hypothesis remains standing tall. Which God? You might ask. Well, in order to find the truth, it appears like a person may need to go at least part of the way down that rabbit hole, after all.